So I've been asked to make a video on Pascal's wager. And I'm actually going to make two videos on Pascal's wager. The first one will be on why Pascal's wager is a logical fallacy. And the second one is going to be on why Pascal's wager is selfish and intellectually lazy and immoral. So Pascal's wager, what is it? It's actually an apologetics argument that originated in the 17th century with a French philosopher by the name of Blaise Pascal. He came up with the Pascal's wager. And many times Christians use Pascal's wager without realizing they're using it. In fact, I've heard it used, and I've even mentioned it by name, and they've said, well, what's that? What's Pascal's wager? So Pascal's wager it's kind of like one of those Christian platitudes that just kind of bounces around in the Christian faith, seemingly without anyone realizing where it came from or where it originated. As far as most Christians are concerned, I think maybe they might have just heard it in a sermon and think their pastor came up with it. Many times when I'm talking with Christians, I have actually asked them to explain to me why they have chosen to believe in things that are not grounded in evidence. For example, why would one choose to believe in a supernatural creator when no such explanation is needed for our existence? Or why would one choose to believe and put all their confidence in the men who wrote the 66 books of the Bible simply because they made claim to having received revelation from a supernatural entity? I mean, we don't believe everyone who runs around saying they're speaking on behalf of God, so why do we have these particular books chosen where we just unquestioningly believe everything they say? And I don't really ever receive satisfactory answers to those questions, but one of the most common answers I receive to that question is it goes something like, if it turns out we're right, then we've everything to gain. If it turns out we're wrong, we have nothing to lose. So clearly they're coming at this from the interest of self-preservation. They're thinking about what is the best way to live just in case this God exists, just in case the Bible's true. And they wouldn't phrase it that way, but really, and I don't even necessarily think that is legitimately the reason why they believe it. I think they're just using that as a good reason. Most of the time we believe things and then we come up with reasons after the fact. And I think Pascal's wager is a great example of that. But I want to be more precise in defining Pascal's wager. And so I want to go and I want to just describe it the way that he would. And Pascal, he believed that everyone should live as if God existed. And if anyone didn't believe in God, they should just try really hard to. They should seek to believe in this God. And his reason for that was because if this God did exist, then it would be worth it to abstain from some of the pleasures and luxuries of this temporal existence in order to earn passage into an eternal existence. So essentially what one would be doing is one would be trading lesser experiences and lesser pleasures in this existence for greater experiences, greater treasures, greater wealth, in the life to come. Simultaneously, one, by following this recipe for living, one would also be avoiding the consequences of not living in deference to this God, which would be fire and torture, hell, basically. So that was kind of Pascal's mindset about this. And if I put on my Christian worldview, it actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, because, I wore that worldview for 30 some years. It's not hard for me to step back into it. And Christians see everything in pretty black and white terms. Romans 1 says that everyone basically believes in the Christian God. Those that claim not to are just suppressing it for one reason or another. So when someone says God, we know, those of us with the Christian worldview, we know that that can only be referring to one entity, the God of the Bible, Yahweh. And we see everything in the terms of you either obey Yahweh, obey the Bible, or ignore Yahweh, which is synonymous with ignore the Bible. It's basically the same options that Adam and Eve were presented with in the garden. So in that respect, Pascal's wager works perfectly well because there's really only those two options. Unfortunately, Pascal's wager is not as rational as it might seem from the Christian worldview. And it sounded perfectly rational to Pascal, I'm sure, because he was coming from the Christian worldview, or at least I assume that he was. But when we take that Christian worldview off and we actually put on the worldview of someone, anyone else, we can see how quickly it falls apart. Pascal's wager is actually a logical fallacy. It is a false dichotomy. And that means that Pascal, he only put two options on the table. He didn't include all of the other possibilities. He left out all the other options, making it seem like there were only two. It's a false dilemma. So we can illustrate this simply by, let's say that someone presents me with Pascal's wager. And I look at it and I say, yeah, I can see how that's rational. I think that that's great. I'm totally on board. I'm a Pascal man from here forward. I am going to live my life in deference to God, whether or not he exists. And I'm trying real hard. I believe that he does exist. I'm going to live my life in deference to him because, it can only result it'll either result in great things, or I'll be too dead to realize I made a mistake. So, great. I'm all set. I've got my insurance policy. I've got my ticket to heaven. No problem, right? Well, in the Christian worldview, great. But we're not in the Christian worldview right now. And when you're not in the Christian worldview, you realize one thing. When someone says that they're going to start living in deference to God, the next logical question is, which God? Which God? Now, that answer is going to vary depending on who you ask. If you ask some guy in the Bible Belt, then it's pretty open and shut. It's clear which God he's talking about most of the time. But let's say you present someone who lives in India with Pascal's wager. And this person who lives in India says, yeah, that sounds really logical. I think that I need to live in deference to Krishna. Well, then it's like you start to see the problems. The cracks in the foundation of Pascal's wager begin to show because you have a guy in the Bible Belt who's taking Pascal's advice. You have a person in India who's taking Pascal's advice. Problem is, they're taking his advice and they're believing in two different gods. Pascal can't help us here because he did not actually offer any sort of a compass, any sort of directions, any sort of mechanism by which we can determine which God we should invest in. I mean, Pascal's wager is really all about making the safe choice. It's about making the conservative choice. It's about hedging your bets. And when you have two different people who used Pascal's wager to arrive at two different gods, you can see that it hasn't helped us any. Each person has a 50-50 chance of being right or wrong, and that's if those were the only two gods. There are thousands of gods. And who's to say that there's not a God who human beings don't even know about, who human beings have not even identified? So there are at minimum like thousands of gods out there. So best case scenario, someone might have like a 1 in 1,000 chance of actually of Pascal's wager actually paying off for them. Everyone believes that the religion that they were born into, that the religion that they believe in and their family believes in, and the predominant religion of their culture is probably the right one. I mean, you just don't see too many people who would conclude, who would suddenly just, they hear Pascal's wagers, so they, this person in Iran hears about Pascal's wagers, so they decide to move to the Bible Belt and start worshiping Yahweh. I mean, that's just not how our minds work. So you can see that there are more choices. Even when you choose God, there are more choices. Which God? Let's go back to the guy in the Bible Belt. The guy in the Bible Belt chooses Yahweh. Let's say he made the right choice, that Yahweh is the real God. So good on him, except there are three different religions that all attest to worshiping Yahweh. They might call him by different names, but it's the same guy, at least in their, as far as they're concerned. You have Judaism, you have Islam, you have Christianity, all big-time Yahweh worshipers. So from there, you have these three options that branch off from this one of thousands of gods. And from that choice, no matter which of those religions you choose, you have more options. If you choose Christianity, then you have Catholicism, you have Protestantism and all of its denominations, you have Mormonism, you have Jehovah's Witnesses, you have Seventh-day Adventists. Each one of these, by the way, believing that they have a corner on truth that all the others don't have. So how does Pascal's wager help us with this dilemma? It doesn't. It doesn't help us at all. So Pascal's wager is essentially useless. It gives us a piece of advice, but it doesn't actually provide us with any guidance on how to follow that advice. It tries to be rational, but it excludes so many options that it really leaves us with no rational way to approach it. I mean, when you really look at it, when you follow Pascal's wager, which is just about, I mean, it's a wager. It's right there in the title. It's about making a wager. It's about hedging your bets. But there's no way to determine what to bet on or what actually is the safest bet. Then doesn't that disqualify all of them evenly, equally, of being a safe bet when you have thousands of options and when they all have an equal amount of evidence to demonstrate their truth, which is zero. So at what point does making a wager, at what point does just making a bet go from sounding like a really rational piece of advice to sounding like a really irrational piece of advice? Would it not, in this case, be far more rational to take an evidence-based approach, to look at each one of these religions and to say, let's see which one of these has any evidence to support their claims? None, 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 none. If you can't take that sort of approach to these religions, then you truly are just making a bet. Only it's not as safe as Pascal makes it sound. It's just, if you happen to find the right one, consider yourself lucky. So I think I'm going to cut it there because I want to talk about why Pascal's wager is intellectually lazy, why it's immoral, why it's selfish, and that'll be in the next video. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching.